Mrs. Martins, could you explain to the court what led you to take such decisive legal action against your husband? When I received my birthday gift, I realized it was time to rewrite my story. A quiet gasp ripples through the courtroom. Eduardo shifts uncomfortably. I told you, Laura. I gave you everything. Wait until your mistress sees what I recorded. Eduardo's glass halts midway to his lips. His smirk fades, replaced by a pale expression. Mrs. Martins, could you elaborate? Of course. It started with subtle changes, but I know my husband too well to let them slip by. Late meeting, just business. When I started noticing his late hours and secretive calls, I knew something was wrong. But instead of confronting him immediately, I collected the pieces quietly. Would you like to submit Exhibit A to the court, Mrs. Martins? Let's proceed. Well, there's no denying this. He's sloppy, he thinks he's untouchable, he won't see this coming. But Laura, are you sure you're ready for what follows? I deserve better. Let him find out the hard way. Then let's expose him. Mr. Martins, do you have anything to say in your defense? Laura was seated at Renato's office desk, her phone lying between them. Renato flipped through screenshots of messages and listened to recordings with a serious expression. This is more than enough, he said, raising an eyebrow, and I thought I had seen it all. Eduardo thinks no one would ever catch him. He underestimates everyone, Laura replied, crossing her arms. And you? Renato asked, leaning forward. Don't you think this will take an emotional toll? It already has. What's left now is to make sure he doesn't get away with it. Renato nodded, placing the phone on the table. He won't see this coming, but we need to carefully plan how to expose it. If we do it right, he'll lose more than you imagine. Laura took a deep breath, staring at the evidence before her. Renato, I want him to feel every second of it. Then let's get started. A few weeks later, Laura stood in front of a glass corporate building. She walked in, passing by receptionists who greeted her politely. In the distance, Carla Ribeiro stepped out of an elevator, chatting animatedly on the phone. Upon seeing her, Laura smiled discreetly. She continued down the hallways until she reached the main meeting room. Inside, Eduardo stood in the middle of a presentation surrounded by colleagues and executives. Laura entered unannounced. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said, her voice firm but polite. Eduardo stopped speaking immediately, his face paling at the sight of her. Laura, what are you doing here? She raised a tablet and, with a tap, an audio recording began to play for the entire room. Eduardo's compromising words echoed. Carla, I told you. I just need Laura to sign the papers. After that, everything will be ours. The room fell into absolute silence. Carla, standing at the door, froze. Eduardo stepped forward. This isn't what it seems, he murmured. But Laura's gaze silenced him. She stopped the audio and turned to leave. I hope your next presentation contains more truth. Renato was waiting outside, a subtle smile on his lips. That was a good start, he remarked. Laura simply nodded, but deep down she felt this was just the first piece of a domino ready to fall. Hello, guys. If you like our stories and haven't, subscribe yet. Support our work and subscribe to the channel to help us. Laura sat in the quiet corner of her living room, the faint hum of the city night filtering through the windows. A glass of wine rested untouched on the coffee table beside her. Renato's voice echoed in her mind. He won't see this coming. But Eduardo wasn't stupid. Careless, perhaps, but not stupid. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. Carla's name flashed on the screen. Laura hesitated for a moment, then answered. Laura, I don't know why I'm calling, but I need to talk to someone. There was a vulnerability in Carla's voice that caught Laura off guard. This is unexpected, Laura replied, leaning back into the couch. You do realize who you're calling, don't you? A nervous laugh from Carla followed. Dosha, and maybe I'm insane for doing it, but after what happened at the office, Eduardo hasn't spoken to me since. I need to understand. Laura considered hanging up. This wasn't her problem, but curiosity held her in place. Understand what? That he was using you? Carla exhaled sharply. I wasn't blind. I knew what I was getting into. I just thought maybe I'd be different. You weren't. Laura said bluntly. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Carla's voice, softer this time. What are you going to do now? Laura swirled the wine glass slowly, watching the liquid spiral. Finish what I started. And what if that destroys him completely? Laura's lips curled into a faint smile. Then I guess he'll finally know how it feels. Carla sighed again, this time heavier. But she didn't argue. Good luck, Laura. The call ended, leaving Laura alone with her thoughts. The following morning, Renato met Laura at the courthouse. He wore the same confident grin he always did when things were going exactly as planned. Ready for today? Laura straightened her blazer and nodded. More than ready. As they stepped inside, Eduardo was already there, sitting in the hallway with his lawyer. His eyes met Laura's, for a brief second before he looked away. He's nervous, Renato whispered. I can see it from here. He should be, Laura replied calmly. When the courtroom doors opened, they all filed inside. The air felt heavier than before, but Laura welcomed it. Eduardo's lawyer stood to make his case first, painting Eduardo as the victim of miscommunication and misunderstandings. Laura listened without reacting, letting the words drift past her. When it was her turn, she rose confidently, handing over a flash drive to the judge. On this drive are multiple recordings and messages that clearly show Eduardo Martin's infidelity, financial manipulation, and intent to deceive me during our marriage. The judge inserted the drive into the laptop. The audio played, Eduardo's voice filling the room, each word cutting deeper than the last. Eduardo's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Eduardo remained frozen, staring at the desk in front of him. When the audio ended, Laura spoke again. I trusted Eduardo for years, but trust once broken cannot be repaired with apologies. This isn't just about betrayal. It's about integrity, respect, and justice. The judge nodded slowly, absorbing every word. Eduardo finally glanced up, but Laura didn't return the gaze. She was already looking ahead toward the future she was rebuilding piece by piece. Eduardo's gaze lingered on Laura as the courtroom fell into an uncomfortable silence. His lawyer whispered something urgently, but Eduardo barely seemed to register it. His mind raced, replaying every word from the recording that had just echoed through the room. Laura, meanwhile, sat back down, her expression calm but unreadable. Renato leaned closer, speaking in hushed tones. That was the hardest hit. Now we let it sink in. Laura nodded subtly, her eyes fixed ahead as the judge shuffled through the documents Renato had submitted alongside the recordings. Across the room, Eduardo finally snapped out of his daze, leaning toward his lawyer. We can challenge the authenticity of the recordings, can't we? He whispered. The lawyer shifted nervously. Not easily. The metadata lines up and she submitted the originals. If we try to deny it, it'll just make you look worse. Eduardo gritted his teeth, glancing briefly at Laura. She hadn't even looked his way once. The judge cleared his throat. Mr. Martins, do you have any counter-evidence to present at this time? Eduardo hesitated, his lawyer urging him to remain quiet. After a few moments, he exhaled sharply. No, Your Honor. Renato allowed himself a faint smile. As the judge reviewed the case, Laura's thoughts drifted back to the weeks leading up to this moment. Every step had felt calculated yet deeply personal. There had been sleepless nights spent questioning if she was doing the right thing. Not for Eduardo's sake, but for her own. She remembered sitting alone in her bedroom, listening to the same recordings over and over, wondering if it would be easier to just walk away and start fresh. But every time she thought of Eduardo's smug face, how he believed he could throw their marriage away so carelessly, her resolve hardened. Renato had told her from the beginning, you're not just fighting for assets, you're fighting to remind him that he underestimated the wrong person. Now, sitting there with Eduardo, squirming under the weight of his own mistakes, she understood exactly what Renato meant. The judge finally spoke, breaking Laura's train of thought. Based on the evidence presented, I find Mrs. Martin's claims credible and compelling. Pending further review, I am inclined to favor her position regarding the division of assets. Eduardo shifted uncomfortably, his lawyer scribbling furiously in his notebook. However, the judge continued, before finalizing this matter, I will allow Mr. Martins an opportunity to respond fully in the next session. Court adjourned for today. The sound of the gavel striking echoed, and the courtroom slowly began to empty. Eduardo rose quickly, striding out without looking back. Renato placed a hand lightly on Laura's shoulder. "He's rattled. You can see it in the way he walked out of here." Laura let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "One more session," she said quietly. "Then it's over." As they exited the courthouse, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the marble steps. Laura paused for a moment, letting the warmth of the sun wash over her face. "You did good in there," Renato said, breaking the silence. Laura glanced at him, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "I know." For the first time in months, she truly believed it. The days leading up to the next court session moved slowly, each one stretching longer than the last. Laura found herself alternating between moments of relief and unexpected waves of doubt. It wasn't that she regretted exposing Eduardo, far from it, but there was an emptiness in knowing that something that had once defined so much of her, life was crumbling piece by piece. Late one evening, Laura sat alone in the kitchen, stirring a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. The silence felt heavy, pressing in from all sides. She thought about calling Renato, but she didn't want to seem weak. He had already done more than enough. Her phone buzzed on the counter, startling her. When she glanced at the screen, her chest tightened. "Eduardo, can we talk?" Laura's finger hovered over the screen. A part of her wanted to ignore it, but curiosity and perhaps something more got the better of her. She tapped the message, her reply brief. "Laura, about what?" The response came quickly. "Eduardo, I just want to meet. 1 hour, neutral ground. I owe you that much." Laura's jaw tightened. "He owes me far more than that." She set the phone down, staring at it as if expecting the conversation to disappear. A long minute passed before she finally typed a response. "Laura, tomorrow, 7 p.m. Café Allegro." The next evening, Laura arrived at Café Allegro early, choosing a table near the window. The cafe was quiet, with only a handful of patrons scattered across the room. Eduardo arrived 5 minutes late, looking tired and worn in a way Laura hadn't seen before. He approached the table cautiously, as if expecting her to lash out the moment he sat down. She didn't. "I didn't think you'd come," he said, signaling the waiter for a coffee. "I wasn't sure either," Laura replied, folding her hands on the table. "So talk." Eduardo shifted in his seat, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm not here to apologize." "Of course not," Laura said, her tone sharper than she intended. He met her eyes for the first time. "I know I screwed up, but I didn't expect it to go this far." "You filed for divorce, Eduardo. You handed me the papers like it was some twisted birthday present. What did you think was going to happen?" He exhaled, leaning forward. "I thought you'd just sign them and let it go." Laura laughed dryly, shaking her head. "That's the problem with you. You think everything's just yours to take or leave." The silence between them thickened. Eduardo traced the rim of his coffee cup absent-mindedly, his gaze distant. "Carla's gone, by the way," he said suddenly. Laura raised an eyebrow. "I'm not surprised. She left a week after the meeting at the office, didn't even say goodbye." "She wasn't the problem, Eduardo. You were." He nodded, as if he already knew. "I thought about calling you before. I wanted to explain." Laura's expression softened, but only slightly. "Explain what? That you got bored? That I wasn't enough?" Eduardo's eyes flickered with something she couldn't quite place. Regret, maybe. "I don't have excuses. I just thought maybe, I don't know, that I could fix things before it got to this point." Laura leaned back in her chair, studying him. "And what would that fix have looked like?" He didn't answer. "That's what I thought," she said quietly. The waiter returned, refilling Eduardo's cup, but neither of them paid much attention. "I guess I just wanted to know if you really want to destroy me," Eduardo finally said, his voice barely above, a whisper. Laura's eyes narrowed. "I don't need to destroy you, Eduardo. You did that on your own. I'm just making sure you can't walk away without facing the consequences." Eduardo let the words sink in, nodding slowly. "Fair enough." As he rose from the table, he hesitated. "I know you probably don't believe me, but I did love you." Laura met his gaze one last time. "I know. That's what makes this worse." Eduardo lingered for a moment longer, before finally walking out of the cafe, leaving Laura alone with the faint hum of background conversations. She stayed there for a while, staring out the window at the city lights, wondering if closure ever really felt as satisfying as people said it would. Laura sat in the cafe long after Eduardo had left, watching as the world outside continued without pause. The city lights flickered and cars streamed by, each one carrying someone with their own burdens, their own stories. The conversation with Eduardo lingered in her mind, replaying in fragments that she couldn't shake. She thought she'd feel victorious, but all she felt was exhausted. By the time she arrived home, the apartment felt colder than usual. The shadows stretched across the floor, long and still. Laura kicked off her shoes, letting them clatter near the door, and sank onto the couch. She pulled a blanket over herself and stared at the ceiling. Her phone buzzed again, and she half expected Eduardo's name to appear. Instead, it was Renato. Renato. How did the meeting go? Laura hesitated before replying. Laura. Uneventful. He tried to justify himself, nothing new. A moment later, another message came through. Renato, you're stronger than most. Some people wouldn't have even met with him. Laura smiled faintly. Laura, maybe I needed to. Renato, I understand. Get some rest, we'll finish this soon. Laura placed the phone on the coffee table and closed her eyes. The final court session arrived quicker than expected. As Laura dressed that morning, she felt lighter somehow. There was no more dread hanging over her. Instead, a sense of finality settled in. Renato greeted her at the courthouse steps, holding a thin folder under his arm. Nervous? He asked, tilting his head. Laura adjusted the bracelet on her wrist. No, I'm ready. They walked inside together, and Laura could feel Eduardo's presence before she even saw him. He sat at the far end of the hall, leaning against the wall, his tie loosened and his hair slightly disheveled. His lawyer whispered something to him, but Eduardo's eyes drifted toward Laura. For the first time, she held his gaze. There was no anger left, just quiet acceptance. When the session began, the courtroom felt colder, as if the weight of everything unsaid hung over them all. The judge reviewed the final evidence, flipping through pages and glancing toward Laura occasionally. Eduardo's lawyer rose to speak. Your Honor, my client acknowledges the evidence presented and expresses his willingness to settle without further dispute. The words seemed to hang in the air. Laura stole a glance at Eduardo, but his expression remained unreadable. The judge nodded. Very well. Based on the presented documentation and mutual agreement, I find in favor of Mrs. Martins regarding the division of assets and financial compensation. This matter is hereby concluded. The gavel struck lightly, signaling the end of it all. Laura exhaled softly. Renato leaned in, whispering, Congratulations. It's over. Eduardo lingered by the door as the courtroom emptied, as if waiting for Laura. As she passed by, he spoke quietly. I meant what I said at the cafe. I know I messed up. I just thought you should know. Laura paused for a brief moment. I know you did, but we can't rewrite the past, Eduardo. She walked away without looking back. Outside, the sky was clear for the first time in days. Renato joined her as they descended the courthouse steps. So what now? He asked with a smile. Laura lifted her face to the sun. I start over, and this time I do it on my own terms. Renato chuckled. I think you already have. As they walked toward the parking lot, Laura felt the weight that had once pressed against her chest slowly dissolve. It wasn't victory or revenge that brought her peace. It was the simple knowledge that she had survived and thrived in spite of it all. In the weeks following the final court session, Laura found herself adjusting to a strange new rhythm, one without Eduardo. The absence of his presence in the apartment felt palpable at first, but day by day it became less noticeable. She began to reclaim the space, rearranging furniture, replacing old photographs with new ones, and repainting the walls in softer tones. It wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about rewriting the story of her home. One afternoon, Laura stood in the middle of the living room, eyeing a bare wall where a large framed picture of her and Eduardo once hung. The outline was faint but still visible. She considered leaving it empty, but something about the blank space felt incomplete. Later that day, she visited a local gallery and picked out an abstract painting, something colorful and chaotic, a stark contrast to the carefully curated art Eduardo preferred. As she hung the painting, her phone rang. Renato's name appeared on the screen. "How's life after the courtroom?" he asked as soon as she answered. Laura stepped back, admiring. "The painting. Quieter, less stressful, but I'm keeping busy." "Good, it suits you." There was a pause on the other end. Then Renato's tone shifted slightly. "I have something for you. Can you meet me for dinner tonight?" Laura raised an eyebrow. "This isn't about the case, is it?" "No, the case is over. Consider this a celebration." "Fine, 7 o'clock? I'll make the reservation." As the call ended, Laura couldn't help but smile. Renato had been a rock throughout the entire ordeal. His unwavering support had kept her grounded when everything else felt like it was falling apart. That evening, Laura met Renato at a small, intimate restaurant tucked away from the main streets. He was already seated when she arrived, a bottle of wine waiting at the table. "Fancy," Laura teased, sliding into the seat across from him. "You deserve it." Renato poured her a glass and raised his in a toast. "To new beginnings." Laura clinked her glass against his and took a sip. "So, what's this surprise you mentioned?" Renato reached into his briefcase, pulling out a small envelope. "I wasn't sure if you'd want this, but I thought I'd offer it anyway." Laura took the envelope hesitantly, sliding out the contents. It was a finalized document detailing the settlement and asset division, official, neat, and bearing. Eduardo's signature. "I already have copies of this, Renato." "I know, but this isn't just a copy, it's the original, straight from Eduardo's lawyer." Laura ran her fingers over the paper, the finality of it sinking in. It felt different, heavier somehow. "I thought you might want to keep it. A reminder." Laura folded the paper carefully, slipping it back into the envelope. "I don't need reminders. I'm already moving forward." Renato smiled, satisfied with her answer. "I figured as much." The rest of the evening passed effortlessly. They talked about work, travel plans, and old memories from university days. For the first time in months, Laura laughed without reservation. As they left the restaurant, Renato walked her to her car. "You know you're different now," he said, hands tucked into his pockets. "Different how?" "Stronger. Like, you've finally figured out who you are without him." Laura leaned against the car door, considering his words. "Maybe I have. It feels freeing." Renato nodded. "I like seeing you like this." There was something in his voice, something Laura hadn't noticed before, a softness, an openness she hadn't expected. "Renato, no pressure, I'm just saying, I'm here," Laura smiled, appreciating the sentiment more than she could express. "I know." As she drove home, Laura thought about the conversation. It was too soon to think about anything beyond friendship, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what the future held. Her story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The weeks turned into months, and Laura's life began to take on a new shape, one that felt distinctly her own. The empty spaces left behind by Eduardo's absence were gradually filled with new routines, hobbies, and friendships that she hadn't realized she was missing. One Saturday morning, Laura stood in her kitchen, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, staring out the window at the city skyline. The light filtered in softly, casting long shadows on the floor. She had come to appreciate these quiet moments, savoring the stillness in a way she never had before. Her phone rang, pulling her out of her thoughts. "Morning, stranger." Renato's voice carried his usual warmth. "I wouldn't call me a stranger. You saw me 2 days ago." "True, but I have news. I thought you might want to hear it in person." Laura raised an eyebrow. "Sounds mysterious. Where are we meeting?" "How about the cafe near the park? Noon." "I'll be there." When she arrived, Renato was already seated outside, sipping an espresso. A newspaper lay folded beside him, and he waved as she approached. You're awfully chipper today, Laura noted, sitting down across from him. Life's good, he replied with a grin, but enough about me. You're the one making headlines. Laura frowned, confused. What are you talking about? Renato unfolded the newspaper and slid it across the table. On the front page, Eduardo's name appeared in bold letters beneath the headline, Martin's firm faces internal shake-up following. CEO departure. Laura's eyes narrowed as she skimmed the article. Eduardo had quietly stepped down from his role at the company, citing personal reasons. He resigned? She asked, barely able to mask her surprise. Looks that way. From what I heard, the board wasn't too happy about the scandal. His reputation took a bigger hit than he expected. Laura leaned back in her chair, letting the news sink in. I didn't think it would happen so soon. You underestimated the power of public embarrassment, Renato said with a smirk. Laura exhaled slowly, unsure of how she felt. Part of her had imagined Eduardo holding onto that position until the bitter end, refusing to let go out of sheer pride. Does this make me a terrible person for feeling relieved? She asked quietly. Renato shook his head. No, it makes you human. Eduardo brought this on himself. You didn't force him out. He did that by burning every bridge he had. Laura nodded, tracing the rim of her coffee cup with her finger. I guess I just didn't expect to care. I thought I was done thinking about him. You are, Renato said gently. This isn't about him anymore, it's about closure. Laura let out a soft laugh. Closure. That word gets thrown around a lot, doesn't it? It does, but maybe that's because it's important. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, the distant hum of the city filling the gaps. So what's next for you? Renato asked eventually, shifting the conversation. Laura smiled. I don't know, and for the first time I'm okay with that. Renato raised his cup in a mock toast. To not knowing. Laura clinked her glass against his. To not knowing. As they parted ways later that afternoon, Laura found herself strolling through the park, the newspaper still tucked under her arm. She paused near a bench, sitting down to watch the people pass by, families, couples, joggers, and children playing on the grass. There was something comforting about the ordinary rhythm of the world. Laura unfolded the newspaper again, skimming the article once more before folding it neatly and placing it on the bench beside her. As she stood up and walked away, she left the paper behind. There was no need to carry Eduardo's shadow with her any longer. The sun hung low in the sky as Laura wandered through the park, her footsteps slow and deliberate. The crisp autumn air nipped at her cheeks, but she welcomed the sensation. It reminded her that she was present. In this moment, in this life, she was carefully rebuilding. As she walked, Laura noticed a small art fair set up along one of the winding paths. Vibrant paintings and handcrafted ceramics lined the booths, and the chatter of local artists filled the air. She hadn't planned to stop, but something about the atmosphere drew her in. She drifted between the booths, admiring the artistry on display. At one stand, a collection of abstract paintings caught her eye. Bright splashes of color overlapped in chaotic yet harmonious patterns, and for a fleeting moment, they reminded her of the painting she'd bought for her living room. You have a good eye, a voice said behind her. Laura turned to find a middle-aged woman, likely the artist, smiling warmly. Thank you. Your work is beautiful, Laura replied, studying one canvas in particular. Art is funny that way, the woman mused. Sometimes it reflects more than just color. It mirrors what's going on inside us. Laura's gaze lingered on the painting. I think you're right. After a brief conversation, Laura purchased the painting. The artist carefully wrapped it, and Laura tucked it under her arm as she continued walking through the park. When she returned home, Laura placed the new piece in her bedroom, leaning it against the wall opposite her bed. She stood there for a while, observing how the soft light filtered through the curtains and illuminated the brushstrokes. She could feel the shift, subtle but undeniable. This space was hers now, and every new addition, every rearranged corner felt like a declaration of independence. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, interrupting the quiet. Renato's name flashed across the screen. Buying more art? He teased as soon as she answered. How did you know? I just had a feeling. You've been in redecorating mode. For months. Laura laughed softly. I guess I have, it helps. You sound lighter today. Laura leaned against the wall, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. I think I am. Renato's voice softened. I'm glad to hear that. I've been meaning to ask, what are you doing this Friday? I don't know yet. Why? There's a charity gala downtown. I have an extra ticket. I thought it might be a nice excuse to dress up and get out for the night. No pressure. Laura hesitated for a moment, not out of reluctance, but from the unfamiliar feeling of excitement she hadn't felt in a long time. I'd like that. Great. I'll pick you up at 7. After the call ended, Laura found herself standing in front of her wardrobe, mentally sifting through her dresses. It had been a while since she'd attended anything formal. She settled on a sleek black dress she hadn't worn in years. As she held it up to the light, she smiled. It wasn't for Eduardo this time. It was for herself. When Friday evening arrived, Laura stood by the window of her apartment, watching the city lights flicker as Renato's car pulled up outside. He greeted her at the door with a warm smile, offering his arm as they descended to the street. You look stunning, he said sincerely. Thank you, it feels good to dress up again. The gala was held in a grand hall downtown, its glass chandeliers casting soft glows across the marble floors. The atmosphere buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the distant sound of live music echoing through the space. Renato guided her through the crowd, introducing her to familiar faces and colleagues. Laura felt more at ease than she had anticipated, even as eyes occasionally flickered toward her. They know about Eduardo, don't they? Laura asked quietly as they stepped aside for a drink. Renato didn't sugarcoat his response. Some do. But tonight isn't about him. It's about you. Laura met his gaze and smiled. I like the sound of that. As the night unfolded, Laura realized she wasn't defined by the shadows of her past anymore. She was stepping into something new, something unknown, but promising. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. The weeks after the gala passed quickly, but their effect lingered. Laura often caught herself smiling at small things, a text from Renato, the way the sun filtered through the curtains in the morning, or the simple peace of waking up without, the weight of her past pressing down on her. One evening she sat curled up on the couch, a book resting on her lap though she hadn't turned the page in a while. Her thoughts drifted back to the gala, to the way Renato had looked at her as they danced, his hand steady on her waist. It felt strange to let someone get close again, but with Renato there was no rush, just an unspoken understanding that neither of them needed to fill the silence with unnecessary words. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She set the book aside and opened it to find Renato standing there, holding 2 cups of coffee. I figured you could use this, he said with a grin, handing one to her. What makes you think I didn't already have coffee? Laura teased, stepping aside to let him in. Call it intuition. Renato settled onto the couch while Laura tucked her legs beneath her, facing him. You've been quiet lately, he noted after a moment. Laura shrugged. I've just been thinking. It's strange, isn't it, to have everything feel calm for once? Renato sipped his coffee, studying her carefully. Strange, maybe, but you deserve calm. You fought for it. She smiled softly. I guess I'm just not used to it yet. Her comfortable silence stretched between them until Renato placed his cup on the table, leaning back. I spoke to Eduardo the other day, he said carefully, watching her reaction. Laura raised an eyebrow, surprised but not unsettled. Really? How did that happen? He called. Said he wanted to talk. It wasn't much, just him tying up loose ends. I think he's finally letting go too. Laura exhaled, feeling the weight of Eduardo's name grow smaller in her mind. That's good. I hope he finds his way. Renato hesitated before speaking again. And you? Do you feel like you found yours? Laura thought for a moment. I think I'm getting there. Renato smiled. Then you're already ahead of most people. The evening slipped by as they talked, laughter bubbling up between stories and shared memories. When Renato finally rose to leave, Laura walked him to the door, lingering for just a moment. Thanks for the coffee, she said softly, her eyes meeting his. Anytime. As he stepped outside, he hesitated. "Laura?" "Hmm?" Renato shifted slightly, as if weighing his words. "I like this, whatever this is between us, but I'm willing to take it as slow as you need." Laura felt a warmth rise in her chest, soft and reassuring. "I like this too, and slow sounds perfect." Renato smiled, and with a nod, he disappeared down the hallway, leaving Laura standing in the doorway with her heart a little lighter than it had been moments before. Later that night, as Laura lay in bed, she replayed their conversation in her head. She didn't know where this path with Renato would lead, but for the first time in a long while she wasn't afraid to find out. The scars Eduardo had left were still there, faint but present, but they no longer defined her. She was ready to write the next chapter, on her own terms. A soft rain pattered against Laura's window the next morning, casting a grey haze over the city. She stayed in bed longer than usual, letting the rhythmic sound lull her into a rare sense of stillness. There was no urgency to her day, no looming meetings, no tense conversations, and no unspoken battles with Eduardo. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She glanced at it, expecting a message from Renato or perhaps one of her friends. Instead, the name flashing on the screen was unexpected. Eduardo. Laura hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen. It had been weeks since the court case concluded, and in that time, Eduardo had kept his distance, something she hadn't questioned. She debated ignoring the call, but curiosity and closure urged her to pick up. "Eduardo?" "Laura, I hope I'm not disturbing you." His voice was softer than she remembered, devoid of the arrogance and dismissiveness that once colored his every word. "No, I was just home. What is it?" Eduardo hesitated on the other end. "I've been thinking a lot, about everything. I know it's too late for apologies to mean much, but I needed to call. I guess I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." Laura sat up, pulling the blanket closer around her. "I know you are, Eduardo." There was a long silence. "I didn't appreciate what I had," Eduardo admitted. "I thought I could have it all, and I convinced myself I wasn't doing anything wrong. I hurt you, and I hate that it took losing everything to realize it." Laura traced patterns on the edge of the blanket with her fingertips. "It's not about what you lost, Eduardo. It's about how you treated the people who trusted you. I know. And I know you didn't deserve any of it." For a moment, Laura felt the familiar tug of old wounds, the memories of betrayal and long nights spent wondering what she had done wrong. But the ache that had once been sharp and consuming felt distant now, like an echo from another life. "I've moved on, Eduardo," she said gently but firmly, "and I hope you find a way to do the same." Eduardo exhaled on the other end, and Laura could almost picture him running his hand through his hair in frustration, the way he always did when he was grappling with something he couldn't control. "I'm trying. For what it's worth, I'm stepping away from the company for a while. I think I need to figure out who I am outside of all of it." Laura smiled faintly. "That's probably a good idea." Eduardo paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. "I'll let you go. I just wanted to thank you for picking up." "Goodbye, Eduardo." As she ended the call, Laura set the phone down and stared out the window. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the clouds were beginning to part. That afternoon, Laura met Renato for lunch at a small cafe near his office. He greeted her with his usual warmth, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he studied her expression. "You okay?" Laura nodded, removing her coat and sitting across from him. "Eduardo called this morning." Renato's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "And?" He apologized, said he's stepping away from the company. Renato leaned back, crossing his arms. "Well, I didn't expect that." "Neither did I, but it feels right, like we're finally done with that chapter." Renato smiled. "I think you've been done for a while, but I'm glad you got the closure you needed." Laura took a sip of her coffee, letting the warmth seep in. "I didn't realize how much I needed it until today." Renato's gaze softened as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "So, what now?" Laura smiled, meeting his eyes. "Now, I focus on what's ahead, and I let the past stay where it belongs." Renato raised his cup in a toast. To what's ahead? To what's ahead, Laura echoed, clinking her cup against his. As they laughed and continued their meal, Laura felt something shift inside her, a lightness she hadn't felt in years. The rain had cleared, and for the first time in a long while, the future felt bright. Hello guys, if you like our stories and haven't subscribed yet, support our work and subscribe to the channel to help us.